We continue now talking about the Baker Topical Guide to the Bible, where we took one section out. Now, don't forget, in that one section, there are lots and lots of scripture and even more topics within that topic. So it's a huge and wonderful thing. So what we have done already, we have used several Bibles. And what I said I would do this time is take a look at, of course, the one that's probably one of the most intriguing, to say the least, of them all. And that is, of course, this one that weighs 500 pounds, the Dake Annotated Reference Bible. Now, here's what's interesting. If we go to the section which we have been dealing with now in the Gospel of Luke and the certain chapters, what you find in the Dake Bible, of course, is not only the text, but as I've said, all these notes. So what we're going to do now is read some of the notes that are in there that will give you an idea of how Dake interprets this particular section. Well, first of all, what he does is talk about this section here, and we're going to go to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, and we're going to find in there just what we're looking for in chapter 14, which is the chapter on the, let me see, what are we doing here? Okay, this is Luke chapter 14, and we begin in verse 25. Luke 14, verse 25. Now, as we go over to verse 25, he usually has little headings for each section. This is called Discipleship Again Tested. And then he gives you another place to look in the scripture. Now, as you know, he has these little letters before each thing. And then there was a great multitude. If any man comes to me and hate not his father and mother and so forth. Now, what he does with this, first of all, Christ on his final trip to Jerusalem to complete his work after the 3 days passed. And then it tells all the places he goes. Now, then he has a letter Q, which means to, if you do not hate your father and mother. Now, what he says about that, an idiom of preference. Then he gives scripture. Then he says, one must prefer God or love him more than all else to be saved. And he gives scripture. Then he said, God first is the motto of the Bible. Then he has another little letter down here that says, 4 things demanded of man here. Here are the 4 things that Dake says. Prefer God and Christ to all other things. Then he gives scripture. Bear the cross. Then he gives scripture. Follow Christ always. Then he gives scripture. Do these things daily, not weekly or for a while. And then he gets down further and he goes to going. Now this is the parable of the tower, and he has a letter S right there for the parable of the tower. Now it says this is a question, illustrates abundant of seeking to be a disciple of Christ without counting the cost. The world, the flesh, and all satanic powers will concentrate upon his defeat. But if one will pay the price of complete surrender, he will be kept by God, who was greater than all of his enemies. Then he gives more scripture. Then we get to another one in the tower. Now, this is the parable of the warring kings. Now, this is what Dake has to say about the warring kings. illustrates the possibility of being saved unless one forsakes all. And then he says another parable illustrates the fact that Christians backslide and lose their Savior when they are not fit for God or man. Then they give a lot of scripture. Now, that is what Dake does with this. As you can see, Dake tends to get into great detail with this. And if one were to follow all of the scripture that he gives with each of these, it would be somewhat like the other Bibles who have all the scripture that they will give. Now, the interesting thing about all of these Bibles, not only the reading that we've done, the actual text which we've read, but the way it can be highlighted, given much more depth and detail of meaning if you use these other Bibles, and I'm mentioning the four of them that we use today. And you remember in this topical book of the Bible, that is only one section of Scripture in that particular place that talks about faith in complete allegiance. Then there are other kinds of faith in there as well. So there's an extremely long section in there. That's why I enjoy that so much. And an example of how one might use just one section of it to get deep into the Bible. And of course, the Bible, all over the place, is not a off-the-cuff thing. It's not something that can be done easily with. If you really want to know the Bible and do the Bible and teach the Bible, then what you must do is understand that the Bible is deep and powerful. It is a challenge, and it is directed to each of us to follow and foster that particular challenge.